Those who first made and thought about cinema began from a simple idea. Cinema, as industrial art, achieves self-movement, automatic movement. It makes movement the immediate given of the image. This kind of movement no longer depends on a moving body or an object which realizes it, nor on a spirit which reconstitutes it. It is the image which itself moves in itself. In this sense, therefore, it is neither figurative nor abstract. But pictorial images are nevertheless immobile in themselves, so it is the mind which has to make movement. It is only when movement becomes automatic that the artistic essence of the image is realized, producing a shock to thought, communicating vibrations to the cortex, touching the nervous and cerebral system directly. Because the cinematographic image itself makes movement, because it makes what the other arts are restricted to demanding or to saying. It brings together what is essential in the other arts. It inherits it. It is, as it were, the directions for use of the other images. It converts into potential what was only a possibility. Automatic movement gives rise to a spiritual automaton in us, which reacts in turn on movement. This spiritual automaton no longer designates, as it does in classical philosophy, the logical or abstract possibility of formally deducing thoughts from each other, but this circuit into which they enter with the movement image, the shared power of what forces thinking and what thinks under the shock, a nuo-shock. Heidegger said, man can think in the sense that he possesses the possibility to do so. This possibility alone, however, is no guarantee to us that we are capable of thinking. It is this capacity, this power, and not that simple logical possibility that cinema claims to give us in communicating the shock. It is as if cinema were telling us, with me, with the movement image, you can't escape the shock which arouses the thinker in you. A subjective and collective automaton for an automatic movement, the art of the masses. Everyone knows that if an art necessarily imposed a shock or vibration, the world would have changed long ago, and men would have been thinking for a long time. So this pretension of the cinema, at least among the greatest pioneers, raises a smile today. They believed that cinema was capable of imposing the shock, and imposing it on the masses, the people. However, they foresaw that cinema would encounter, and was already encountering, all the ambiguities of the other arts, that it would be overlaid with experimental abstractions, formalist antics, and commercial configurations of sex and blood. The shock would be confused in bad cinema with the figurative violence of the represented, instead of achieving that other violence of a movement image, developing its vibrations in a moving sequence, which embeds itself within us. Worse still, the spiritual automaton was in danger of becoming the dummy of every kind of propaganda. Thus the power or capacity of cinema was in turn revealed to be only a pure and simple logical possibility. At least the possible took on a new form here, even if the people were not yet a match for it, and even if thought was still to come. Something was in play in a sublime conception of cinema. In fact, what constitutes the sublime is that the imagination suffers a shock which pushes it to the limit and forces thought to think the whole as intellectual totality, which goes beyond the imagination. According to Eisenstein, the first moment goes from the image to thought, from the percept to the concept. The movement image cell is essentially multiple and divisible in accordance with the objects between which it is established, which are its integral parts. There is shock of images between themselves according to their dominant characteristic, or shock in the image itself depending on its components, and again, shock of images depending on all their components. The shock is the very form of communication of movement in images. The shock has an effect on the spirit. It forces it to think, and to think the whole. The whole can only be thought, because it is the indirect representation of time, which follows from movement. It does not follow like a logical effect analytically, but synthetically, as the dynamic effect of images on the whole cortex. Thus it relies on montage. Although it follows from the image, it is not a sum but a product, a unity of a higher order. The whole is the organic totality, which presents itself by opposing and overcoming its own parts, and which is constructed like the great spiral in accordance with the laws of dialectic. The whole is the concept. This is why cinema is dubbed intellectual cinema, and montage, thought montage. Montage is in thought the intellectual process itself, or that which, under the shock, thinks the shock. Whether it is visual or of sound, the image already has harmonics, which accompany the perceived dominant image, and enter into their own ways into suprasensory relations. This is the shock wave, or the nervous vibration, which means that we can no longer say, I see, I hear, but I feel. Totally physiological sensation. And it is this set of harmonics acting on the cortex which gives rise to thought, the cinematographic I think, the whole as subject. From the shock of two factors, a concept is born. This is the cinema of the punch. The cinematographic image must have a shock effect on thought, and force thought to think itself, as much as thinking the whole. This is the very definition of the sublime. But there is a second moment, which goes from the concept to the affect, or which returns from thought to the image. It is a matter of giving emotional fullness or passion back to the intellectual process. Not only is the second moment inseparable from the first, but we cannot say which is first. Which is first, montage or movement image? The whole is produced by parts, but also the opposite. There is a dialectical circle or spiral, monism. The whole as dynamic effect is also the presupposition of its cause, the spiral. The organic has as correlate the pathetic. The highest form of consciousness in the work of art has as correlate the deepest form of the subconscious. Following a double process, or two coexisting moments. In the second moment, we no longer go from the movement image to the clear thinking of the whole that it expresses. We go from a thinking of the whole, which is presupposed and obscure, to the agitated, mixed-up images which express it. The whole is no longer the logos, which unifies the parts, but the drunkenness, the pathos which bathes them and spreads out in them. From this point of view, images constitute a malleable mass, a descriptive material loaded with visual and sound features of expression, synchronized or not, zigzags of forms, elements of action, gestures and profiles, syntactic sequences. This is a primitive language or thought, or rather an internal monologue, a drunken monologue, working through figures, metonymies, synecdoches, metaphors, inversions, attractions. From the outset, Eisenstein thought that the internal monologue found its extension and importance in cinema, rather than literature, but he still restricted it to the course of thought of a man. Earlier, we went from the shock image to the formal and conscious concept, but now from the unconscious concept to the material image, the figure image which embodies it and produces shock in turn. The figure gives the image an affective charge, which will intensify the sensory shock. The two moments are mixed up, interlaced. Even when the European cinema restricts itself to dream, fantasy, or daydreaming, its ambition is to bring the unconscious mechanisms of thought to consciousness. It is true that cinema's capacity for metaphor has been called into question. Jakobson noted that cinema is typically metonymic because it essentially proceeds by juxtaposition and contiguity. It does not have metaphor's specific power of giving a subject, the verb or action of another subject. It has to juxtapose the two subjects and so make the metaphor subject to a metonymy. Cinema cannot say with the poet, hands flutter. It must first show hands being moved about quickly and then leaves fluttering. But this restriction is only partially true. It is true if we compare the cinematographic image to an utterance. It is false if we take the cinematographic image for what it is, movement image, which as well as dividing movement by connecting it to the objects between which it is established, metonymy, which separates images, can dissolve movement by connecting it with the whole that it expresses, metaphor which connects images. It thus appears to us correct to say that Griffith's montage is metonymic, but Eisenstein's metaphoric. If we talk about fusion, we are not just thinking of superimposition as a technique, but of an affective fusion which is explained in Eisenstein's terms because two distinct images can have the same harmonics and so constitute metaphor. Metaphor is defined precisely by the harmonics of the image. But cinema also achieves metaphors in the image and without montage. Metaphor is sometimes extrinsic, sometimes intrinsic, but in both cases the composition does not simply express the way in which the character experiences himself, but also expresses the way in which the author and the viewer judge him. It integrates thought into the image, what Eisenstein called the new sphere of filmic rhetoric, the possibility of bearing an abstract social judgment, a circuit which includes simultaneously the author, the film, and the viewer is elaborated. The complete circuit thus includes the sensory shock which raises us from the images to conscious thought, then the thinking in figures, which takes us back to the images and gives us an affective shock again, making the two coexist, joining the highest degree of consciousness to the deepest level of the unconscious. This is the dialectical automaton. The whole is constantly open, the spiral, but so that it can internalize the sequence of images as well as becoming externalized in this sequence. The whole forms a knowledge in the Hegelian fashion, which brings together the image and the concept as two movements, each of which goes toward the other. There is still a third moment, equally present in the two previous ones, not from image to concept, or from concept to image, but the identity of concept and image. The concept is in itself in the image, and the image is for itself in the concept. This is no longer organic and pathetic, but dramatic, pragmatic, praxis, or action thought. This action thought indicates the relation between man and world, between man and nature, the sensory motor unity, but by raising it to a supreme power, monism. Cinema seems to have a real vocation in this respect. As Bazin said, the cinematographic image contrasts with the theatrical image, and that it goes from the outside to the inside, from the setting to the character, from nature to man. In the sublime there is a sensory motor unity of nature and man, which means that nature must be named the non-indifferent. Action thought simultaneously posits the unity of nature and man, of the individual and the mass. Cinema as art of the masses. It is indeed true that the three relationships between cinema and thought are encountered together everywhere in the cinema of the movement image. The relationship with the whole, which can only be thought in a higher awareness. The relationship with the thought, which can only be shaped in the subconscious unfolding of images. The sensory motor relationship between world and man, nature and thought. Critical thought, hypnotic thought, action thought. These two joint reasons, mediocrity of products and fascism of production, can explain a great many things. For a brief moment, Artaud believes in cinema and makes a number of declarations which seemed to coincide with those of Eisenstein or Gantz. New art, new thought. But he very quickly renounces it. Perhaps there is a third reason oddly capable of restoring hope and a possibility of thinking in cinema through cinema. We must study the case of Artaud more closely. He says specifically that cinema must avoid two pitfalls: abstract experimental cinema, which was developing at the time, and commercial figurative cinema, which Hollywood was imposing. He says that cinema is a matter of neurophysiological vibrations, and that the image must produce a shock, a nerve wave which gives rise to thought. For thought is a matron who has not always existed. Thought has no other reason to function than its own birth, always the repetition of its own birth, secret and profound. He says that the image thus has as object the functioning of thought, and that the functioning of thought is also the real subject, which brings us back to the images. He adds that the dream as it appears in the European cinema inspired by surrealism is an interesting approximation, but inadequate in relation to this goal. The dream is too easy a solution to the problem of thought. Artaud believes more in an appropriateness between cinema and automatic writing, as long as we understand that automatic writing is not at all an absence of composition, but a higher control, which brings together critical and conscious thought and the unconscious in thought, this spiritual automaton, which is very different from the dream, which brings together a censure or repression with an unconscious made up of impulses. The spiritual automaton has become the mummy, this dismantled, paralyzed, petrified, frozen instance, which testifies to the impossibility of thinking, that is thought. As long as he believes in cinema, he credits it not with the power of making us think the whole, but on the contrary with a dissociative force, which would introduce a figure of nothingness, a whole in appearances. As long as he believes in cinema, he credits it not with the power of returning two images and linking them according to the demands of an internal monologue and the rhythm of metaphors, but of unlinking them according to multiple voices. Internal dialogue's always a voice in another voice. In short, it is the totality of cinema-thought relations that Artaud overturns. On the one hand, there is no longer a whole thinkable through montage. On the other hand, there is no longer an internal monologue utterable through image. It might be said that Artaud turns around Eisenstein's argument. If it is true that thought depends on a shock which gives birth to it, the nerve, the brain matter, it can only think one thing, the fact that we are not yet thinking. The powerless to think the whole and to think oneself, thought which is always fossilized, dislocated, collapsed, of being, of thought which is always to come, is what Heidegger discovered in a universal form, but it is what Artaud lived as the most singular problem, his own problem. Between Heidegger and Artaud, Maurice Blanchot was able to give the fundamental question of what makes us think, what forces us to think, back to Artaud. What forces us to think is the in-power of thought. Un pouvoir, the figure of nothingness, the inexistence of a whole which could be thought. What Blanchot diagnoses everywhere in literature is particularly clear in cinema. On the one hand, the presence of an unthinkable in thought which would be both its source and barrier. On the other hand, the presence to infinity of another thinker in the thinker, who shatters every monologue of a thinking self. The sensory motor break makes man a seer who finds himself struck by something intolerable in the world and confronted by something unthinkable in thought. Between the two, thought undergoes a strange fossilization, which is as it were its powerlessness to function, to be, its dispossession of itself and the world. For it is not in the name of a better or truer world that thought captures the intolerable in this world. But on the contrary, it is because this world is intolerable that it can no longer think a world, or think itself. The intolerable is no longer a serious injustice. but the permanent state of a daily banality. Man is not himself a world other than the one which he experiences the intolerable and feels himself trapped. The spiritual automaton is in the psychic situation of the seer who sees better and further than he can react, that is, think. Which then is the subtle way out, to believe not in a different world, but in a link between man and the world, in life or love. To believe in this as in the impossible, the unthinkable, which nonetheless cannot but be thought. Something possible, otherwise I will suffocate. It is this belief that makes the unthought the specific power of thought. Through the absurd, by virtue of the absurd, Artaud never understood powerlessness to think as a simple inferiority, which would strike us in relation to thought. It is part of thought, so that we should make our way of thinking from it, without claiming to be restoring an all-powerful thought. We should rather make use of this powerlessness to believe in life, and to discover the identity of thought and life. It is clear from the outset that cinema had a special relationship with belief. The modern fact is that we no longer believe in this world. We do not even believe in the events which happen to us, love, death, as if they only half concerned us. It is not we who make cinema. It is the world which looks to us like a bad film. Only belief in the world can reconnect man to what he sees and hears. The cinema must film not the world, but belief in this world, our only link. The nature of the cinematographic illusion has often been considered restoring our belief in the world. This is the power of modern cinema when it stops being bad. Whether we are Christians or atheists, in our universal schizophrenia, we need reasons to believe in this world. Our belief can have no object but the flesh. We need some very special reasons to make us believe in the body. We must believe in the body, but as in the germ of life, the seed which splits open the paving stones, which has been preserved and lives on in the holy shroud, or the mummy's bandages, and which bears witness to life in this world as it is. We need an ethics or a faith which makes fools laugh. It is not a need to believe in something else, but a need to believe in this world of which fools are a part. This is the first aspect of the new cinema, the break in the sensory-motor link, action-image, and more profoundly in the link between man and the world, great organic composition. The second aspect is the abandoning of figures, metonymy, as much as metaphor, and at the deeper level, the dislocation of the internal monologue as descriptive material of the cinema. Cinema of cruelty, of which Artaud said that it does not tell a story but develops a sequence of spiritual states, which are deduced from one another as thought is deduced from thought. It is cinema's automatic character which gives it this capacity, in contrast to the theater. The automatic image demands a new conception of the role, or of the actor, but also of thought itself. Only he who is chosen chooses well or effectively. This could be one of Romer's proverbs. What constitutes the whole is the relation between automatism, the unthought, and thought. The interstice is primary in relation to association. Our irreducible difference allows resemblances to be graded. The fissure has become primary, and as such grows larger. It is not a matter of following a chain of images, even across voids, but of getting out of the chain or the association. Film ceases to be images in a chain, an uninterrupted chain of images, each one a slave of the next, and whose slave we are. It is the method of between two images, which does away with all cinema of the one. It is the method of and, this and then that, which does away with all the cinema of being equals is. Between two actions, between two affections, between two perceptions, between two visual images, between two sound images, between the sound and the visual, make the indiscernible, that is, the frontier, visible. C'est soit deux. The whole undergoes a mutation, because it has ceased to be the one being, in order to become the constitutive and of things. The constitutive between two of images. Interstices proliferate everywhere in the visual image, in the sound image, between the sound image and the visual image. That is not to say that the discontinuous prevails over the continuous. On the contrary, the cuts or breaks in cinema have always formed the power of the continuous. But cinema and mathematics are the same here. Sometimes the cut, so-called rational, forms part of one of the two sets, which it separates, end of one or beginning of the other. This is the case with classical cinema. Sometimes, as in modern cinema, the cut has become the interstice. It is irrational and does not form part of either set, one of which has no more an end than the other has a beginning. False continuity is such an irrational cut. Epstein had already demonstrated that the continuous and the discontinuous were never opposed to each other in the cinema. What are opposed, or at least distinguished, are rather two ways of reconciling them according to the transformation of the whole. It is here that montage comes into its own. As long as the whole is the indirect representation of time, the continuous is reconciled with the discontinuous in the form of rational points, and according to commensurable relations. But when the whole becomes the power of the outside, which passes into the interstice, then it is the direct presentation of time, or the continuity, which is reconciled with the sequence of irrational points according to non-chronological time relationships. We have seen that the power of thought gave way to an unthought in thought, to an irrational proper to thought, a point of outside beyond the outside world, but capable of restoring our belief in the world. The question is no longer, does cinema give us the illusion of the world? But how does cinema restore our belief in the world? This irrational point is the unsummonable of Wells, the inexplicable of Robbe Grillet, the undecidable of restlessness, the impossible of Duras, or again what might be called the incommensurable of Godard, between two things. It is reflection in genres, anonymous or personified, which constitutes the novel, its plurilingualism, its speech, and its vision. Godard gives cinema the particular powers of the novel. He provides himself with the reflexive types as so many interceders, through whom I is always another. It is a broken line, a zigzag line, which brings together the author, his characters, and the world, and which passes between them. Thus, modern cinema develops new relations with thought from 3 points of view: the obliteration of a whole or of a totalization of images, in favor of an outside which is inserted between them, the erasure of the internal monologue as whole of the film, in favor of a free indirect discourse and vision, the erasure of the unity of man and the world, in favor of a break which now leaves us with only a belief in this world.